Rent control is back in the headlines, but is it the solution to the affordable housing crisis or a recipe for disaster? A crucial new study claims rent control actually hurts the very people it's designed to protect. Joining me today is Leah Cuffey, Director of Advocacy Research at the National Apartment Association, to unpack the findings and ignite a much-needed conversation about sustainable housing solutions. Leah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
I think it's really cool that what we're going to sit here and talk about today is rent control, and the president just also talked about some caps on rent control, right? So it feels very timely that we get to have this conversation.
Absolutely. Do you have a crystal ball or something?
Just got lucky on this guess.
Yes, perfect timing. So I'm really excited for us to have this discussion with everything that's going on, with this potential of a federal rent cap. So really looking forward to our conversation today.
Excellent. Well, I think we should probably break into it just a little bit. So just to give the background information, you wrote a wonderful article in NAA Units that was about the ripple effect, rent regulation, and its effects on housing and neighborhood quality. And for any of our listeners, I highly recommend you go listen or read that particular article in Units. It's actually really fantastic and also helps paint the picture of why this is such a really interesting topic and why it's probably at the forefront of all the LinkedIn posts you're seeing right now. And so, Leah, my first question to you is that the study focused on the 15 largest metropolitan areas. Why these specific areas? And do you believe the findings would translate to smaller cities or towns?
NEA, we sponsored an empirical rent control study, which was led by Dr. Andrew Hansen from the University of Illinois, Chicago. So thank you so much for your compliments on the article, but I definitely have to give credit due to Dr. Hansen. My article is a summary of the great work that he did to look at a study that looks at the relationship between rent control and housing quality issues. So Dr. Hansen, he analyzed data from the US Census Housing Americans Survey, and the American Housing Survey consistently surveys housing units in the 15 largest metropolitan areas, and it provides a ton of data that covers a wide range of quality issues. So what's so great about that survey is that it provides this comprehensive data set to observe changes in housing conditions over time within this controlled sample because it's the same housing units throughout the study period. And that really helps to ensure consistency. And the American Housing Survey, it also tracks the number of housing units covered in rent control areas, making it this ideal data set for examining the relationship between rent control and housing quality. And to answer your second question, while these findings are specific to these larger urban areas, they likely hint to similar trends in smaller cities or towns, especially those that are experiencing rapid growth in demand and also housing shortages.
The Sun Belt for anyone listening. You mentioned the American Housing Survey, a wonderful piece of data that's out there. But did the study control for other variables that might impact housing quality, things like median income, building age, or natural disaster prevalence in those particular areas?
No. So the purpose of this study is to specifically examine the relationship between the quality of housing in neighborhoods to an increase in rent controlled units in a market. So it's important for me to note that the research doesn't say that rent control results in X, Y, and Z housing quality issues, which would require to control for those variables that you just mentioned. The goal of the study was to understand if there is a relationship between housing quality issues and rent regulation, which is in fact what the study found. It did find a strong correlation between the increase in the number of rent controlled units and housing quality. It found that when the number of rent control units in an area doubles, there's this strong correlation with a 16% increase in severely inadequate housing.
Well, that's a big number. And I definitely want to dig into this with you a little bit more, but I have one final question just to understand the study and hopefully give the listeners also some information behind it. The study period was between 2015 and 2021, and every time I think we can finally move past saying the pandemic, I feel
Yes.
like we're always roped right back into it. And so my question is, how might recent factors like the pandemic and inflation right now have impacted the findings of the study?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So, the pandemic and ongoing inflation have intensified, many underlying housing issues, potentially, exasperating these effects of rent control. So, with increased economic instability, that might lead to even more pronounced maintenance deferrals. Housing providers, they'll commonly defer maintenance project to save um, or prioritize, available funding to these higher priority expenses. And in fact, in 2021, the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies, they surveyed about 2,500 housing providers across 10 US cities. And it was really interesting because the study reported a 26% increase in housing providers opting to defer maintenance. Um, and the study, they actually showed that they noted that some of the reasonings why housing providers were opting to defer maintenance were related to non-payment of rent due to the eviction moratorium. So, housing providers, they're having to make these really tough decisions, which may affect the maintenance of their properties when dealing with these financial pressures. And, whether those financial pressures are a result of the pandemic or rising costs of operating an apartment led by inflation.
Yeah, definitely inflation rates right now are suffocating, I think, to some owners. And
Yeah,
so to hear that there's possibility of these rent caps coming into place, it's really important to understand how these things can affect the macro scale. And I think the information you're providing is perfect. And so now let's dig a little bit deeper into some of those findings, right? The article, and I guess the study overall, highlights the link between rent control and interior deficiencies. Could you elaborate on some of the potential long-term consequences of these deferred maintenances you're speaking about for both residents and owners?
absolutely. So, deferred maintenance, it not only jeopardizes the residents' quality of life, but it may also lead to this significant depreciation in the condition of a property, which then leads to declining property values. So, over time, this can deter new investments in an area and perhaps lead to properties that haven't been receiving the maintenance that it needs being taken off the market. So both of these factors affect housing affordability because, as we know, that imbalance of housing supply and the demand of housing, that's the root cause to escalating housing costs. So, when we're not developing or investing in housing, and also naturally occurring affordable housing is being taken off the market, this only worsens housing affordability for renters.
That makes incredible sense. And when we're already facing a housing shortage and the ultimate goal here is to solve for housing affordability, it seems like we might be moving in the opposite direction when it
Absolutely.
comes to that. So, also looking at the study, though, it's wonderful to learn about the interior deficiencies. And I don't know if I want to say wonderful, but it's important for us to know about that. The study itself found a weaker correlation between rent control and exterior issues. I have my own personal thoughts on why that might be. And before I break into some of that, I want to ask you, so beyond just structural safety, why might owners or landlords, right, prioritize exterior maintenance? And what message does that send about the impact of rent control?
Great question again. So, I think in general, housing providers, property owners of all types, right? understand the importance of the exterior maintenance to preserve the property value and also the curb appeal of their investments. Because those things are essential for attracting residents, especially in competitive markets. So if you can't attract residents, that impacts your bottom line, which of course leads to this decline in property values. And if an area has rent control and investors and developers see property values falling, in addition to this lack of curb appeal in an area, they'll be more inclined to invest and develop in other areas. And in fact, we engaged NDP Analytics to conduct in depth interviews with property owners, investors, and developers in markets that have rent control policies. And we wanted to learn more about how rent control policies influence their operations and also their development plans. So overall, over 70% of housing providers or developers say that rent control impacts their investment and development plans. And that includes actions such as, reducing their investments, shifting plans altogether, or even canceling their plans altogether. So I think it's really important to understand that rent control has this really harmful domino effect and can lead to renters having limited options for housing. And it's also important for me to emphasize that, rent control, it's been proven over and over, time and time again, to be this failed policy because it fails to address what we were talking about earlier. It fails to address that root cause of housing affordability because it does nothing for increasing the supply of housing.
Yeah, I think it's really important to place an emphasis on this. This is not the first time ever that we as a society have looked at rent control policies. This is
Right.
something that economists at every major academic institution have looked at, and everyone kind of universally agrees that
Yeah.
putting rent caps actually de-incentivizes developers and the development of new housing and things like that, simply because it puts a limit on what we can do. And when that happens, the money side of this, right, doesn't work out. The rising cost of materials, the inflation, and the rates of these loans, it starts to become a little bit trickier to say, with rent control, we should build more houses. And that's, again, like you're saying, the absolute root cause. Going back just a little bit, though, when talking about these exterior issues, one of the things that we have found at J. Turner Research is that there is a direct correlation between perceptions of safety and overall cleanliness. What I'm glad to see is that the exterior maintenance is one of these things that is maybe slightly less affected, right? Because I do think that that might be a more critical issue if you let properties start to, unfortunately fall apart on the outside, right? I think that you're inviting and opening the door to crime, and I understand that crime can happen anywhere, but sometimes there are things that we can do that definitely affect that, and so the article in Units touches on crime and neighborhood decline just a little bit. Could you explain the causal chain the study suggests connecting rent control to these issues? And are there other factors that could contribute to these societal problems that weren't addressed?
Sure. So the study indicates that the presence of rent control has this relationship or correlation with reports of serious crime, also residents disagreeing that schools in their area are considered good. And also, there's this relationship between rent control and reports of large amounts of trash in the streets. And, by no means is the study saying that residents in rent controlled apartments are, committing more crime or they're littering. But it shows that there's evidence between this spatial spillover. And that spatial spillover effect refers to how rent control properties influence the investment and development decisions of housing providers. And so, we talked about this earlier. Rent control deters investment and development in areas because it caps potential ROI, and it makes it extremely difficult for housing providers to keep up with the pace of increasing operational expenses. So, when an area is subject to rent control, there's less investment and development, which can then lead to this decrease in property values. Which, when there's this decrease in property values, there's also a decline in property taxes, which are, of course, essential for providing important services to a community.
While I may complain about property taxes every now and then in my own personal life, I do enjoy that the parks and roads near my house are very well upkept. So
Absolutely.
lots of really good information in the article. And again, the findings are consistent with what other academics who have researched this have always said about rent control policies. But yet, there are always still people on the opposite side, right? The other side of the fence, uh, who, in their minds, think that are justifying the unification behind arguing the opposite side of this, right? And so my first question to you about the people who want to challenge our thoughts and stance on rent control is this. Critics argue that rent control is necessary to protect vulnerable residents from displacement. How does this study address this concern, and what are alternative solutions that are offered?
Right. So, I think, let me start off with saying, I think oftentimes it's looked at as there's being these two opposing sides, right? But those who might be considered or referred to as tenant advocates and those who are housing providers, we all want the same thing. We all want to provide safe housing for renters at all income levels. So, while rent control aims to protect renters, our studies suggest that it often harms the quality of life for renters and their communities by reducing the overall quality of housing. Rent control, like you mentioned earlier, it's one of the most famous and most thoroughly studied examples of price control. And numerous empirical studies have observed time and time again these harmful effects of rent control policies. No matter what your political background, these researchers, economists have consistently found that rent control leads to this lack of housing supply and just exasperates housing affordability challenges because it stifles development and even contributes, as we've been talking about today, it contributes to the deterioration of properties. So, understanding these real impacts of rent control is more important than ever, because we're trying to navigate this potential federal rent control that could dramatically affect, the rental housing market, but also renters. And I think that's why this study is so important and why it's so unique because it paints this vivid picture of how rent control will impact the daily lives of renters. And, so here at NAA and a lot of other um, organizations in our industry, we advocate for solutions that, build more housing because once again, you're getting to the root cause of housing affordability. So we're in support of the Yes in My Backyard Act, which promotes housing supply and increases a more sustainable, or I should say, it supports a more sustainable approach to housing affordability.
So before I break into the next question here, I think it's really important that we just reiterate here. What we're saying is that there is a vicious cycle that we will get ourselves in with rent control, where the whole idea is we just need more supply, right? Supply demand curves will say that if there's more supply, then the cost of things will go down, and this is how this works with housing. Rent control policies will instead place the pressure on developing less, right? Which means that overall, we're still going to be the exact same place, but it's going to be even trickier for everyone. That's the ultimate thing here. And I'm really glad you brought up the Yes in My Backyard Act, simply because I do see it as a solution here. Uh, but I want to ask you your thoughts on how this particularly for low income renters, you think works out for them because when people want to advocate for, tenant rights, and I would prefer the term resident rights myself, but when they want to advocate for that, usually they do it behind low income renters. And so my question to you is, how does the Yes in My Backyard act as a solution for these low income renters?
Right. So supporting initiatives like the Yes in My Backyard Act or the YIMBY Act, it can help eliminate these barriers to new housing development, promoting a healthier, more dynamic housing market where we're able to build housing at all income levels, and that works not only for renters who are looking for more affordable housing, but when you have less barriers or when it's more affordable to develop housing, that's also a win for developers and investors. So by encouraging development and investment, we can better mitigate the negative impacts of rent control and improve overall housing quality and housing affordability. So what the YIMBY Act does is that it seeks to eliminate the exclusionary zoning laws and also other barriers that restrict housing development. And so promoting more inclusive and diverse housing options that encourages the construction of new units, which can then help to alleviate that housing, that supply and demand imbalance that we were talking about earlier.
That's wonderful and fully agree. I do think that zoning restrictions sometimes get in the way of development. We're only allowed to build certain things in certain places, but the freedom to be able to build more housing in areas will again work to offer more supply, which should again bring rent prices, which is one of the things down that the whole point of this is for. Leah, I want to move away from the article and let's, take a big 10,000-foot step back and just look at all this and say, looking forward, how do we think these things will shape out? And so the article itself, and I think even the research report, paints a pretty stark picture of rent control's consequences. Do you believe there are any scenarios where rent control could be implemented effectively without these negative outcomes? Or is it always the case that, this lack of supply will put, demand in a weird place?
Yeah, so the industry is fundamentally opposed to rent control. No matter the scope, it's rent control comes in a couple of different names, right? There's stabilization, there's rent caps, there's rent regulation. We're opposed to all of that because once again, both research and lived experiences have proven time and time again that rent control does not work. And it devastates the rental housing industry and harms the affordability of housing because it's distorting the market and it's limiting the availability of housing for renters. So, instead, we should really be focusing on solutions that address the full problem and that are targeted to those who are in need of help and assistance the most.
Perfect. Leah, if I gave you a magic wand and said, wave this wand and you can give any policymakers the key takeaways you hope that they glean from this particular study, what do you hope they take away from this?
Rent control, although it seems like an attractive and quick fix, it only worsens housing affordability because it leads to housing shortages and also housing quality issues. So policymakers should really be focusing on policies and solutions that provide more housing supply and also make it easier for housing providers to maintain the quality of housing.
Excellent. And so, just your own personal thoughts here. What further research do you think is needed to fully understand the complex relationships between rent control, housing quality, neighborhood well-being, supply chain dynamics? What else? What else do we need?
I think just, continuing to monitor these markets that do have, rent regulation in place, to then be able to fully understand these long-term effects that rent control is having on housing markets, and especially under varying economic conditions. I think it's also important to look at how rent control can lead to an increase in rents. So I would say those two things, but more importantly, just continuing to monitor these markets so that we can really have this solid data and have this solid evidence of how rent control is impacting the housing market.
Wonderful. Leah, if anyone wanted to reach out to you or get more information from NAA around this particular topic, how would they go about that?
Absolutely. So, one, I encourage you to visit the NAA website, which you can do at naahq.org. There is a ton of amazing resources, not just on research, but also if you're looking to get the latest news on what's going on with this proposed federal rent control. Our government affairs team does a great job in sending out up to date, important updates about how things are progressing. And as they receive information, we feed that to our members and our audiences. So I encourage you to visit a website, or if you'd like, you can also reach out to me directly. I'm more than happy to discuss this research in more depth, and also talk about the more harmful impacts of rent control.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Leah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Marcus. This was a great discussion.
Statistics paints a stark picture, but behind each percentage point is a family dealing with roaches, a single mom worried about a leaky roof, a community starved for resources. Rent control might sound good on paper, but the reality is far more complex. We need to demand better for our residents, for our neighborhoods, and for the future of the industry. If you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to subscribe to the Multifamily Review on your favorite podcast platform, and be sure to check out all of the research and resources at naahq.org.